At 9:42 a.m., January 17th, 1940, Scapa Flow, Orkney Islands. The wind came hard across the black water, salt-thick and relentless, rattling the steel bones of HMS Rodney as she swayed at anchor. In the belly of the battleship, below the armored decks where the great guns slept, a man sat hunched over what looked like a child's science project. A tangle of copper wire, cathode tubes scavenged from broken radios, and a wooden frame that had, until 3 weeks prior, supported his kitchen table in a cramped Portsmouth flat. The glow of the vacuum tubes cast shadows across Commander Robert Watt's face, making him look less like a naval officer and more like a monk illuminated by candlelight, searching for something the world had not yet learned to see. Outside, the North Atlantic stretched infinite and hostile. Beneath its surface, 40 German U-boats were moving. No one knew they were there. No one, that is, except the clockmaker. Watt was not a clockmaker by trade, though. His fingers moved with the same patient precision. He was a meteorologist, a radiophysicist, a man who had spent the previous decade studying thunderstorms and measuring the invisible. He had learned to read the language of electromagnetic waves the way a shepherd reads the sky before snow. And now, in the frozen belly of a warship, he was attempting something the Admiralty had dismissed as fantasy, teaching metal to see through darkness. They had mocked him, of course. At the Naval Research Laboratory, senior officers had toured past his improvised apparatus with the tight-lipped courtesy reserved for the delusional. Kitchen table radar, one captain had called it, not bothering to lower his voice. Another had asked, with the dry humor of a man who has seen 100 inventions fail, whether Watt planned to detect submarines or cook breakfast. The laughter had echoed in the steel corridors long after the inspection ended. But Watt did not remove his contraption. He did not file it away in some dusty archive of failed experiments. Instead, he worked through the night, soldering connections by the light of a single bulb, while above him, the war pressed closer with every passing hour. Because he had seen something in those thunderstorm studies, something that haunted him. Radio waves did not simply travel outward into nothing. They bounced. They reflected. They returned home like pigeons carrying messages from the invisible world. And if they could return from a thundercloud, Watt reasoned, they could return from a steel hull cutting through the Atlantic darkness. All one needed was the patience to listen, and the courage to believe in echoes. The winter of 1939 had taught the Royal Navy a vocabulary of terror. U-boats, the Kriegsmarine called them, Unterseeboote, though to the British sailors who watched their convoy ships explode in columns of black smoke and burning oil, they were simply the invisible death. Submarines had existed in the Great War, but these were different, faster, quieter, coordinated by radio into hunting packs that could strangle Britain's Atlantic lifeline with methodical efficiency. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's submarine fleet, had studied the British supply routes with the cold attention of a surgeon mapping arteries. He knew that Britain imported 90% of her grain, 80% of her fuel. He knew that every ton of cargo lost was a meal that would never reach London, a tank that would never roll off a factory line, a bullet that would never find its chamber. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who had served on submarines in the previous war, that Britain could be starved into submission if only his U-boats could hunt without being hunted. In the first 4 months of war, German submarines sank over 100 Allied merchant ships. The Royal Navy responded with the only tools it possessed: convoys protected by destroyers, depth charges dropped blindly. Into the churning sea, hydrophones that could sometimes detect the distant thrum of propellers, but only if the submarine was careless and the ocean was calm. It was hunting by sound in a world of noise, searching for ghosts in a hurricane. The U-boats, meanwhile, attacked at night, surfacing under cover of darkness to use their deck guns, then vanishing beneath the waves before dawn could betray them. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and simple. Germany was building submarines faster than Britain could sink them. If the trend continued, if the numbers held, the war would be over by Christmas, not with a bang, but with empty warehouses and bread lines stretching to the horizon. This was the context in which Watt sat in the belly of HMS Rodney, staring at his kitchen table radar, willing it to see. The device itself looked like something assembled by a determined child with access to a university physics department. The transmitter was built from components meant for a commercial radio station modified to emit short bursts of electromagnetic energy at a frequency of 20 megahertz. The receiver, salvaged from various sources Watson Watt preferred not to enumerate in official reports, was connected to a cathode ray oscilloscope, itself borrowed from a medical laboratory where it had been used to study heartbeats. The entire apparatus was mounted on the wooden frame from his kitchen table because the Navy had refused to provide proper materials until the concept was proven. The irony was not lost on Watson Watt. They wanted proof before they would give him the tools to provide proof. But he had learned, in his years studying storms, that nature cared nothing for bureaucracy. Radio waves would bounce off steel whether the Admiralty believed in them or not. The only question was whether he could build a receiver sensitive enough to hear the echo return. On the night of January 16th, he had finally succeeded in detecting something, a faint blipping, the oscilloscope, barely distinguishable from the noise. It could have been a reflection from the harbor wall. It could have been interference from the ship's own electrical systems. It could have been nothing. But Watson Watt had marked the position and the time. And 6 hours later, a submarine had been spotted by visual lookout in that exact location. One echo, one confirmation. It was not enough to convince the Admiralty, but it was enough to convince Watson Watt to keep watching. The German submariners, for their part, had their own expectations of this war. They had been told, in the training facilities at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, that they were the elite, the tip of the spear, the hunters who would bring England to her knees. They had been shown propaganda films of British merchant ships breaking apart under torpedo strikes, of survivors floating in burning oil, of convoys scattering in panic. They had been promised glory, adventure, the satisfaction of strangling the British Empire with their bare hands. What they had not been promised was the reality of submarine warfare. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann, commander of U-47, had written in his diary after his third patrol, "The smell is what breaks you first, not the danger, not the cold, not even the boredom. The smell of 50 men living in a steel tube for 8 weeks without fresh air, without proper sanitation, without any escape from the stench of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies and the chemical toilet that floods every time we crash dive. We surface at night to run the engines and ventilate the boat, and the crew stands on the conning tower, gulping air like drowning men, because for a few minutes we can breathe something that doesn't taste like death." This was not the war they had imagined. This was not the swift, clean hunt promised by the recruitment posters. This was survival in a hostile medium, fighting not just the enemy, but the ocean itself, the crushing pressure, the mechanical failures, the slow accumulation of carbon dioxide when they ran silent at depth. This was a war fought in darkness, in silence, in the intimate knowledge that death could arrive without warning. A depth charge splitting the hull, water roaring in, pressure crushing bone and metal alike before there was time to scream. And yet, they hunted. Because that was what submariners did. That was their purpose, their function, their pride. In mid-January 1940, Dönitz ordered a major offensive. 40 U-boats, nearly half the operational submarine fleet, were to converge on the western approaches, the shipping lanes that funneled supplies toward Britain. It would be the largest coordinated submarine operation of the war to date, a wolf pack designed to overwhelm the convoy defenses through sheer numbers. The submarines departed from bases in Germany and occupied Norway, slipping into the Atlantic under cover of storms, planning to assemble at their patrol stations by January 17th. They expected to hunt, unseen as they always had. They expected the darkness to protect them, as it always had. They did not expect the clockmaker to be watching. Watson Watt did not sleep on the night of January 16th. He sat before his oscilloscope, watching the green trace sweep across the screen, waiting for echoes that might mean nothing or might mean everything. The ship's crew had learned to ignore him, this strange civilian in naval uniform who muttered equations to himself and took notes in a cipher of mathematical symbols they could not read. At 0200 hours, he saw the first clear return, a spike in the signal, sharp and distinct, at a range of 8 nautical miles. He marked it on his chart, calculated the bearing, checked his mathematics twice. At 0215, another return, 7 miles, slightly different bearing. At 0230, 3 more. The oscilloscope was painting a picture of movement, of multiple objects converging on the anchorage. Watson Watt stood up so quickly he knocked over his cold tea. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the awful weight of certainty. He was seeing them. He was actually seeing them. The electromagnetic echoes were returning from submarine conning towers and periscopes, painting their positions on his screen as clearly as if they were flying flags. He ran to the bridge, climbing ladders with the graceless urgency of a man who has forgotten how to care about dignity. The officer of the watch looked up from the compass with the weary irritation of someone interrupted during a quiet watch. "Submarines," Watson Watt said, breathless. "Multiple contacts, converging on our position." The officer's expression was a masterpiece of polite skepticism. "Visual confirmation?" "No visual. Radar detection. My apparatus." "Your kitchen table." Watson Watt's jaw tightened. "Yes, my kitchen table, which is currently detecting what appears to be a significant submarine presence at ranges between 5 and 10 miles. Commander, it's pitch dark. We have lookouts posted. If there were submarines that close, You would see nothing," Watson Watt interrupted, his voice rising despite himself. "Because they're running on the surface, low to the water, in darkness. You won't see them until they're close enough to launch torpedoes, but I can see them now. I can see them on my screen, and there are at least 8 distinct contacts, possibly more." The officer of the watch hesitated. The sensible thing, the career-preserving thing, was to dismiss the civilian's panic and return to established procedures. But something in Watson Watt's face, the wild certainty, the mathematical conviction, gave him pause. "I'll inform the captain," he said finally. Captain Frederick Dalrymple Hamilton of HMS Rodney had not risen to command a battleship by entertaining the fancies of eccentric scientists. But he had also not survived 25 years in the Royal Navy by ignoring intelligence, even when that intelligence came from a contraption built on kitchen furniture. He came down to Watson Watt's station in his dressing gown, hair uncombed, face creased with the irritation of interrupted sleep. He looked at the oscilloscope. He looked at Watson Watt's charts, covered in careful notations of bearing and range. He looked at the device itself, with its exposed wiring and improvised components, and Watson Watt could see the judgment forming behind his eyes. "How certain are you?" Dalrymple Hamilton asked. "The returns are consistent with steel structures at the ranges indicated," Watson Watt said, forcing his voice to remain calm, professional. "The pattern suggests coordinated movement, multiple vessels on converging courses." "Consistent with," suggests. "Commander, I need more than theoretical possibilities if you're asking me to scramble the fleet in the middle of the night." Watson Watt met his gaze. "Then wait 15 minutes, sir. Watch the screen with me. If I'm wrong, the contacts will disappear or prove to be atmospheric anomalies. If I'm right, they will continue to close on this position with mechanical precision." Dalrymple Hamilton checked his watch. 15 minutes, he agreed. They watched together, the captain and the clockmaker, while the oscilloscope painted its story in flickering green light. The returns did not disappear. They did not scatter randomly like atmospheric noise. They moved with the deliberate coordination of a planned operation, drawing closer to Scapa Flow with every sweep of the screen. At 02:47 hours, Dalrymple Hamilton picked up the bridge telephone. "Sound General Quarters," he said. "All ships in harbor, prepare for submarine attack. Illuminate searchlights on my command." The alarm bells shattered the night. Across Scapa Flow, battleships and cruisers blazed into life, crews tumbling from bunks to battle stations, main batteries swinging toward the darkness. And at 0251, when the searchlights blazed out across the water, they caught them. A German submarine surfacing 2 miles off Rodney's bow, caught in the sudden glare like a thief in the act. The submarine crash-dived immediately, but it was too late. The destroyers were already moving, their ASDIC pinging, their depth charges ready. Within 20 minutes, 6 more submarines had been detected. Their surprise attack transformed into a desperate retreat. The wolf pack scattered, their coordinated operation dissolved, their invisible advantage stripped away by a beam of radio waves and a civilian sitting at a kitchen table. By dawn, 3 U-boats had been sunk. 7 more had been damaged and forced to abort their missions. The remaining 30 fled westward, their crews shaken by an impossible reality. Somehow, the British had seen them coming. In Berlin, Donat stared at the patrol reports with incomprehension. "They knew," he said, reading the debriefing from one of the surviving commanders. They were waiting, as if they could see through the darkness. The German submariners who survived that night carried the experience with them like a wound that would not heal. They had trained for many possibilities: depth charge attacks, collision, mechanical failure, the slow suffocation of a damaged boat trapped at depth. But they had not trained for this. The sensation of being known while they believed themselves hidden, of being hunted while they thought themselves hunters. Kapitän Leutnant Werner Hartenstein of U-156 wrote to his wife 3 weeks after the Scapa Flow incident in one of the rare letters that survived the war. "It is a different kind of fear, Liebling. When a depth charge explodes, you can hear it, feel it, understand it as the enemy's response to something we did, a noise we made, a periscope we raised. But this new thing, this knowing we cannot explain, it feels like fighting a ghost. We surface at night, as we have always done, believing the darkness makes us invisible. And then the searchlights find us instantly, as if they knew the exact moment we would emerge. The men are beginning to whisper about secret weapons, about British radios that can hear our thoughts. I tell them this is nonsense, that there must be a rational explanation. But, I confess, I do not know what that explanation is. I only know that the sea no longer feels like our domain." This was the transformation Watson Watt's device had created, though he would not learn of it for years. It was not merely a tactical advantage. It was a psychological inversion, a reversal of the hunter-prey relationship that had defined submarine warfare since its inception. The U-boat crews had built their identity on their invisibility, their ability to strike from the depths and vanish before retaliation could arrive. Now that invisibility was compromised in ways they could not comprehend or counter, and the psychological effect rippled through the Kriegsmarine like a crack through ice. German naval intelligence launched frantic investigations. Had the British developed underwater microphones so sensitive they could hear a submarine's engines from miles away? Had they trained dolphins or seals to hunt submarines? Had they broken the German codes and were reading the operational orders? The truth, that electromagnetic waves were bouncing off conning towers and returning to improvised receivers, was considered and dismissed as technically implausible. The German scientific community, which had done pioneering work on radio detection in the 1930s, had concluded that the wavelengths required for useful naval radar would require antennas so large as to be impractical for shipboard use. They were correct, of course. Watson Watt's device was impractical. It was temperamental, unreliable, prone to interference and false returns. The range was limited, the resolution poor, the accuracy inconsistent. But it worked. And in the mathematics of war, a device that works imperfectly is infinitely more valuable than a perfect device that does not exist. The symbolism that would come to define this moment in naval history was not the radar screen itself, though that green glow would become iconic in later years. It was, improbably, the kitchen table, that domestic object transformed into an instrument of war, representing the improvisation and stubborn ingenuity that would characterize Britain's survival through the dark years ahead. Watson Watt kept that wooden frame throughout the war. When the Admiralty finally provided proper materials and funding, when radar evolved from an improvised curiosity into a sophisticated network of installations that would help win the Battle of Britain and guide night fighters to their targets, he kept the kitchen table as a reminder. Colleagues who visited his laboratory in the later war years would see it there, tucked in a corner, still bearing the scorch marks from overheated vacuum tubes and the pencil annotations of those first experimental nights. That table, Watson Watt would later write in his memoirs, represented everything the Germans underestimated about British resistance. They expected we would need perfect equipment, proper facilities, official approval before we could begin fighting back. They expected our bureaucracy to strangle our innovation, our class system to prevent a meteorologist from advising naval commanders, our caution to paralyze our creativity. What they did not expect was that we would pull a table out of a kitchen, wire it up with salvaged parts, and use it to look through the darkness. They expected we would fight by their rules. We fought with whatever came to hand. This philosophy extended beyond radar. In factories across Britain, workers were improvising, adapting, transforming civilian infrastructure into military production with a speed that astonished German intelligence. Automobile plants became tank factories. Furniture workshops produced aircraft components. Women who had never held welding torches learned to build ships. The entire nation became, in essence, a kitchen table, not perfect, not elegant, but functional and fierce and unwilling to accept defeat. The Germans, by contrast, had prepared for war with Prussian thoroughness. Their weapons were engineered to perfection, their tactics rehearsed until they achieved mechanical precision, their supply chains organized with bureaucratic exactitude. But this very thoroughness became a liability when circumstances deviated from the plan. German tank production, for instance, involved such tight tolerances and specialized components that repairs in the field often required parts shipped from specific factories in Germany. British tanks, cruder in design, could be repaired with whatever materials were available. It was the difference between a Swiss watch and a blacksmith's hammer. One was undeniably superior in engineering, but when you needed to drive a nail in the middle of a battle, superiority of design was no substitute for availability of function. By February 1940, the Admiralty could no longer dismiss Watt's invention as a curiosity. The reduction in successful submarine attacks in radar-equipped zones was too significant to ignore. Ships equipped with even the most primitive radar sets were detecting submarines at ranges that allowed for effective evasive action or preemptive attack. Convoy losses in the western approaches dropped by 40% in areas where radar coverage was available. But the technology was fragile, the equipment scarce, the trained operators nearly non-existent. Watt found himself transformed from ridiculed eccentric to desperately needed expert, pulled into high-level planning meetings, where admirals asked questions he was still learning to answer. How much power did the transmitter need? What frequencies worked best? Could radar detect submarines when they were submerged, or only on the surface? Could it work in storms, in fog, in the electromagnetic chaos of combat? The honest answer to most of these questions was, we don't know yet. But Watt had learned to translate scientific uncertainty into bureaucratic confidence. We are conducting experiments to determine optimal parameters, he would say, which meant he was trying random modifications to see what worked. The theoretical models suggest promising avenues for development, which meant he had a hunch he couldn't yet prove. We require additional resources to accelerate the research timeline, which meant, please, for the love of God, give me real equipment instead of salvaged radio parts. The Admiralty, to their credit, began to listen. By spring, a proper research facility had been established, with real funding and official support. Engineers were recruited from universities and private industry. Manufacturing contracts were let for specialized components. The improvised prototype was gradually transformed into something approaching a deployable system. But Watt never forgot that the war had not waited for proper research facilities. The war had come knocking in January 1940, and he had answered with a kitchen table and some wire, because that was what he had available, and the ships were dying, and there was no time for perfection. The U-boat crews learned to adapt, as warriors do. They began diving earlier, staying submerged longer, approaching targets from unexpected angles. They developed tactics to minimize their surface exposure, using the night hours for movement and spending daylight hours at depth. They learned to read the sea, to sense when British destroyers were near, to trust their instincts even when logic suggested they were still invisible. But the adaptation came at a cost. Submarines that spent more time submerged covered less distance, had fewer opportunities to charge batteries, gave their crews less access to fresh air. The patrols became longer, more exhausting, more psychologically grueling, and always, in the back of every submariner's mind, was the question that had no answer. How are they finding us? The mortality rate for U-boat crews in 1940 rose to levels that shocked even Dönitz, who had built his career on cold-blooded calculations of acceptable losses, 70%, 80%. By 1944, when the radar networks had matured and Allied air cover extended across the Atlantic, the survival rate for a U-boat crew completing a full tour of duty had dropped below 25%. The submarine service, which had begun the war as an elite force of volunteers, became a posting men tried desperately to avoid. In the British Naval Archives, there is a photograph taken in late 1940 showing Watt standing beside an early production radar unit aboard HMS Sheffield. He is smiling, though the smile does not reach his eyes. He is thinking, perhaps, about the German sailors who had drowned because of his invention. He is thinking about the British merchant crews who had not drowned because of his invention. He is performing the moral calculus that all weapons designers must eventually face: the arithmetic of lives saved against lives taken, the impossible ethics of choosing which strangers will live and which will die. There is no clean answer to this calculation. There is only the knowledge that the war was happening whether he participated or not, and his participation changed the outcome. And the mathematics suggested that more people were alive because of what he had done. It was a cold comfort, but it was the only comfort available. The radar technology that began with Watt's kitchen table evolved rapidly throughout the war. By 1943, British and American radar systems could detect submarines on the surface from over 20 miles away, track aircraft at high altitude, guide fighter interceptors to their targets in complete darkness, aim naval guns with precision that shocked observers. The magnetron, developed at Birmingham University, allowed for microwave radar, sets small enough to fit in aircraft, creating the possibility of hunting submarines from the air. The entire electromagnetic spectrum became a battlefield, with researchers racing to find new frequencies, new techniques, new ways to see the invisible. The Germans developed their own radar systems, of course, though they lagged behind Allied development by crucial months. They created radar detectors that could warn submarines when they were being illuminated by British radar, allowing them to dive before the enemy closed to attack range. This triggered another round of innovation, with the British developing radar sets that operated on frequencies the German detectors could not sense. The technological race continued throughout the war, each side adapting to the other's innovations, neither achieving permanent dominance but both fundamentally transforming the nature of naval combat. But the psychological impact of that January night in 1940 persisted throughout the conflict. The German Naval Command never fully recovered its confidence after the Scapa-Flow incident. The operational plans became more cautious, more conservative. The bold surface raids that had characterized early U-boat doctrine gave way to deeper patrols, longer submergences, a fundamental wariness that reduced operational effectiveness even when radar was not present. This was perhaps Watt's greatest contribution, though it was never quantified in official assessments. He had taught the enemy to fear the darkness instead of trusting it. He had taken their greatest advantage, invisibility, and transformed it into a source of paranoia and doubt. On May 8, 1945, when the war in Europe ended, Robert Watson Watt was in his laboratory at Malvern, conducting experiments on weather radar. He had returned, in a sense, to his original passion, the study of thunderstorms and atmospheric phenomena. But the work was different now. The equations were the same, but they carried the weight of everything that had come between, all the ships that had made it safely to port, all the submarines that had not returned to base, all the lives rearranged by electromagnetic waves bouncing off steel in the darkness. He kept the kitchen table in his office until his retirement, and then in his home, and then in a museum where it sits today with a small plaque that reads, "From this frame, modern naval radar was born." The plaque does not mention the mockery, the skepticism, the desperate improvisation. It does not mention the 40 U-boats that converged on Scapa-Flow, expecting invisibility and found illumination instead. It does not mention the transformation of submarine warfare from a German advantage to a slow war of attrition they could not win. But the table itself remembers. In the scorch marks and the pencil annotations, in the holes drilled for mounting brackets and the stains from spilled tea, it remembers the night when a meteorologist taught metal to see through. Darkness, and in doing so, changed the mathematics of survival. The German submariners who survived the war and wrote memoirs decades later would speak of many things: the claustrophobia, the fear, the bonds of crew unity forged in shared danger. But they spoke with particular weight about the moment when their invisibility became uncertain, when the dark sea that had protected them became a source of dread. "We were the hunters who learned we could be prey," wrote Karl Donitz in his prison memoirs. "We had built our entire doctrine on the assumption that we could see them, but they could not see us. When that assumption proved false, everything else unraveled, not immediately, not catastrophically, but slowly and inevitably, like a ship with a hull breach sinking so gradually that the crew does not notice until the water reaches their bunks." This was the larger truth that Watt's device revealed, that technological advantage in war is not merely about having better weapons, but about psychological dominance, about controlling the terms of engagement, about making the enemy fight in the way you have prepared for, rather than the way they have chosen. The radar gave Britain something more valuable than the ability to sink submarines. It gave them the ability to make submarines afraid of being sunk, which changed behavior, which changed tactics, which changed outcomes in ways that cascaded through every level of naval warfare. The American military observers who studied the radar developments with interest would learn this lesson thoroughly. When they entered the war, they brought with them a philosophy of overwhelming technological superiority, an industrial capacity to produce not just adequate equipment, but superior equipment in crushing abundance. The German U-boat crews who faced American destroyer escorts equipped with production line radar sets, sonar systems, hedgehog depth charges, and air support from escort carriers learned what British merchant sailors had experienced in reverse. That being outmatched in every technical category was a psychological burden that no amount of courage could fully overcome. In the final reckoning, Watt's radar accounted for the detection and sinking of hundreds of submarines, the protection of thousands of merchant vessels, the safe delivery of millions of tons of supplies. But these numbers, impressive as they are, do not fully capture the significance of what happened in January 1940. What happened was simpler and more profound. A man refused to accept the idea that darkness was an insurmountable advantage. He believed that electromagnetic waves could be made to carry information from places human eyes could not reach. He built a device from salvaged parts and kitchen furniture to test this belief. And when the device worked, when the echoes came back carrying news of submarines in the night, he did not wait for perfect equipment or official approval. He simply pointed at the screen and said, "There, they are there." The courage required for this act is easy to underestimate from the distance of 80 years. We live in an age where radar is ubiquitous, where we expect technology to show us the invisible, where the idea of detecting objects by radio waves seems obvious and elementary. But in 1940, it was not obvious. It was speculative, uncertain, unproven. And Watts staked his professional reputation, his credibility, his entire career on the gamble that those faint green blips on an oscilloscope screen represented real submarines and not atmospheric noise. He was right. And because he was right, and because he was willing to be wrong publicly if necessary, the mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic shifted just enough to make British survival possible. The kitchen table still exists, preserved in the Science Museum in London, a silent witness to the moment when improvisation became innovation and desperation became invention. Visitors walk past it daily, most without stopping, without recognizing the scuffed wood and drilled holes as the birthplace of a technology that now guides aircraft to landing, tracks satellites in orbit, maps weather systems from space, and warns of missiles launched continents away. But some visitors stop. Some read the plaque and understand what they are seeing. Evidence that the most sophisticated technologies sometimes begin with the simplest materials. That genius is often less about having resources and more about using whatever resources exist. That wars are won not by those who wait for perfect conditions, but by those who act with imperfect tools and imperfect circumstances. The table speaks to this truth. It says that democracy's advantage over fascism was not moral superiority alone, though that mattered. It was also practical adaptability, the willingness to let a meteorologist advise admirals, to build weapons from salvaged parts, to trust that cleverness and determination could compensate for gaps in industrial preparation. It was the kitchen table philosophy of warfare. Use what you have, improvise what you need, and never let perfection become the enemy of action. The Germans, for all their technical brilliance and military precision, could not match this flexibility. They built submarines according to exacting specifications, but they could not adapt when those specifications no longer matched the changed circumstances of war. They developed doctrine based on invisibility, but they could not reimagine their tactics when invisibility was compromised. They expected their enemies to fight according to predictable patterns, and they were confounded when those enemies pulled tables from kitchens and wired them into weapons. This confusion, this inability to anticipate or understand improvisation, was perhaps fascism's deepest weakness. Authoritarian systems excel at executing predetermined plans with mechanical efficiency, but they struggle when circumstances require deviation, innovation, creative chaos. They cannot easily tolerate the disorder inherent in true innovation, the messy process of trial and error, the necessary freedom to fail and try again. Watt's radar emerged from exactly this kind of creative disorder. It was built outside official channels, tested without proper authorization, deployed before anyone fully understood how it worked. By the time the bureaucracy caught up and began imposing structure and standards, the fundamental breakthrough had already occurred, the proof of concept had already been demonstrated, and the momentum toward full development had become unstoppable. This was Britain's secret weapon, more potent even than radar itself, the ability to function effectively while partially disorganized, to maintain enough chaos in the system that innovation could occur while maintaining enough order that innovations could be recognized and deployed. It was democracy's answer to fascist efficiency. Not greater efficiency, but greater adaptability, the capacity to stumble forward through setbacks and learn from mistakes without the process destroying the system itself. The 40 U-boats that converged on Scapa Flow in January 1940 expected to find a sleeping enemy. What they found instead was a watchman who had learned to see in the dark, a clockmaker's patience applied to the chaos of war, a kitchen table transformed into an instrument of survival. They fled into the Atlantic night, confused and shaken, carrying with them the knowledge that the rules had changed in ways they did not understand. And behind them, in the belly of HMS Rodney, Watts sat watching his oscilloscope screen, watching the echoes fade as the submarines retreated, and allowing himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He had not won the war. The war would continue for 5 more years, would claim millions more lives, would test Britain to the edge of collapse and beyond. But he had won this night. He had proven that ingenuity could overcome material disadvantage, that improvisation could match precision, that a civilian with a kitchen table could teach the Royal Navy how to fight invisible enemies. And in the mathematics of war, where victory is measured in accumulated small advantages, this night mattered. This proof of concept mattered. This transformation of radio physics from academic curiosity to tactical weapon mattered. The clockmaker had given Britain the ability to see through darkness. And in the years ahead, as radar networks spread across the island and the Atlantic and eventually the world, that sight would prove to be one of the decisive advantages that turned the tide of war. But it began here, with a kitchen table and some wire, with a man who refused to accept that darkness was permanent, with echoes returning through the night, carrying news of submarines that thought themselves invisible. It began with the simple, revolutionary belief that the invisible could be made. Visible, if only one knew how to ask the darkness the right questions, and had the patience to listen for the answers echoing back. If this story of innovation against impossible odds inspired you, if Watts' courage to trust his convictions moved you, then help us share these forgotten tales of World War II. Like this video to support documentary storytelling that goes beyond the textbooks. Subscribe to join a community that believes history's most important lessons are found not in grand strategies, but in moments when ordinary people refuse to accept defeat. And share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that the greatest technological breakthroughs often begin with the simplest acts of defiance. Sometimes all it takes is a kitchen table and the courage to believe in echoes.